Hi, friends. So maybe today we could talk a little bit about God's design for parents and for children. And we don't have to look any further in the scriptures than the Old Testament and the book of Samuel. In fact, 1 Samuel 1, verses 24 through 28, it's a story about Hannah and Samuel. So let me give you a bit of the background real quick. So Hannah was not able to have children. She was older and she was barren. And so she says to God in a prayer through the priest Eli, who is there in the temple, that she is desirous of a child, and if God gives her a child, then she would dedicate the child to the service of God and to His people. Okay, right there we should stop, and because we see something of God's design in the Old Testament for all parents and for children. And that is this, is that none of us, without the power of God, the grace of God, are ever really able to have children. Because all that we supply is the material, okay? The man and the woman, to put together a human being. But God not only thought about that person long before that loving embrace, but God also gives the soul, creates the soul, the immortal soul, right? And then the parents cooperate with God and His grace to create the total person. So there's this no parent would be able to have a child without God's design for children, for humanity, let alone breathing life in the soul, the anima, into that child at the very cellular level at the moment of conception. So let's just acknowledge that right from the beginning, that children are a gift from God. But what Hannah does is very important for us to pay attention to. And that is, she promises God that if she does have a child, she would dedicate that child to the service of God, to the temple and to His people. This is so important, and parents need to remember this, is that the child, when Hannah returned 3 years after the birth of Samuel, and dedicated her child to the service of God in the temple, she did this because she recognized that Samuel really didn't belong to her, that Samuel belonged to God. And how many parents don't know this? Or maybe they know it intellectually, or they know it from something they were taught in religion class in school or PSR, but don't know this on an existential level, don't live this out. And they live as if the children belong to them. And so what happens is they shape and form the children according to their will, or according to their fears, according to their wants, their desires, their dreams for their children, rather than God's dream for His child, His son and daughter, which He's given to mom and dad to raise up to Him, to dedicate, to consecrate to Him, so that God's will be done in that child's life. God can give His mission, His purpose, His reason for being for that son and daughter, and they can fulfill that, God's design for them, rather than live out mom and dad's design for them. And herein lies a reason for a lot of troubles, not just in the family, but in our world today. Because we all pass through the family. And the church passes through the family in its members, right? If we're raising up our children like Hannah, as a model of parenthood, raises her child Samuel up to God, my God, our families would be in a very different place right now. Our church and the vocations that come from our church and into our church, our priesthood would be very different. Our leaders of the world would be very different. Our leaders in our church would be very different. Husbands and wives and moms and dads would be very different if they picked up 1 Samuel 1, 24 through 28, and really prayed with it, and really started to discern and see this is God's design. This is how He wanted parenthood to be all along. And here's the thing too, this is ironic, is that every mom and dad who presents their child to the temple, today's language, the church, and dedicates the child makes a promise at his or her baptism. And the promise they make is basically the same promise that Hannah made, that they will raise their children up in the ways of Jesus and of his church. And ultimately so that that child can come to know God, love God, and serve God, and be happy with God in this world, and forever happy with him in the world to come. Even as those children experience light and darkness, good and bad, evil and good, sin and forgiveness, that every human being is going to experience, right? Temptations and triumphs. But what we're seeing today is, even though parents have made that promise, not to the priest, but to God himself, they're not allowing that promise to be fulfilled. You know, look at how many of our children, parents put through all kinds of activities, spend countless hours with their children, allowing their children to be shaped and formed in sports and academics, in their careers and clubs and teams and extracurriculars in the arts and so on. So much time on that. But then how does that stack up against the time that they give their children to the Lord, and they shape and form their children in the ways of the Lord, compared to all the other ways of the world? And then we see the lie exposed. We see what happens to the promise. We promise our children to the ways of the world rather than promise our children to the ways of God. And then we wonder, for instance, why our children, when they grow up into adulthood, now in today's world, it's before adulthood. It's sometimes in their middle school or their high school years or during their college years, and they don't believe in God anymore. And they don't go to church and pray, and they're living out a worldly life, not a godly life. And we wonder what went wrong, because I took my kid to church every Sunday. It's not just that. It's all those hours stacked up against one another. The ways of the world and the ways of God. You know, those ways of God have to come into our lives as moms and dads, into our lives as husbands and wives, into our lives as family. And we have to teach our children the ways and the wills of God. And truly, when we promise, then dedicate and consecrate our children to those ways of God, so they grow up in those ways, and then they see the good that's in this world and can live it and live among it, but they can see the bad in this world and reject it, and even be a part of redeeming it. But be in this world, but not of this world, but of God and of his ways, and then be able to be the people that God created them to be. The people, in fact, for the reasons that God gave your children to you. Now, Hannah does a beautiful job of showing us in just a few passages God's original design for parents and for children. Every parent following that method, that way, from the Old Testament and going through the New Testament, even to this day in the Catholic Church, which is a biblical historical church. Every parent who presents their child to a church and to God has that child baptized. Just remember what you're promising, what you have promised at that age. That you would dedicate this children to God and to the ways of God, and raise them up according to Christ. And when you do that, here's the thing. Everything that you hope for your children, it will not only be fulfilled, but it will go beyond what you hope for your children. Your children will be happy, because there's no one in this world who can make them more happy than God. Your children will also know God and love God and be able to serve God. And then your children also will live a life in which not only they are able to respond to the salvation, a gift, but not a guaranteed one because we have to open it and live it. A gift that God gives to all of us. They'll be able to get into heaven, and then you and them will be happy with God forever, rather than trying to make them happy for a few short years with you while they're in your household, but setting up for a life in which they're not going to be happy for the rest of their life because their life as an adults are without God, and they may risk not even being happy with God forever in the life of heaven, and then not being happy with you in the life of heaven. I mean, what do you want? Do you want the long game or the short game? What do you want? Every parent that I've learned and met wants the happiness of their children. And if you want that for your children, what parent wouldn't want that? Then follow Hannah's plan. Follow God's design for parents and for children. Until next time.